It's been a while since I've done a video, and there are a number of reasons why I haven't. I think the biggest one is just mostly I've not been sure what I wanted to do. However, the first video I made on my channel was a first impression video of Akame got killed, because I was really excited when the anime was originally announced, because I read the manga. Now it's been 24 long weeks, and here I am with a new video, as well as my verdict on Akame ga Kill. The premise of Akame ga Kill is relatively simple. You've got Tatsumi, who's part of a village who's relatively poor and not really getting any sort of help. In order to improve the condition of his village, he ventures out to the capital in order to try and obtain great fortune in order to help them out. Of course, being in the capital, he learns immediately that his goals of getting good fortune are next to impossible, and even further into the capital, he realizes just how fucked up of a place it really is. After he's exposed to the evils of the capital itself, he joins Night Raid, a team of assassins who's working with a revolutionary army to try and bring peace back to this empire that's so corrupt. And that's about as far as plot goes for this show. It doesn't really do anything other than that. It stays in one direction for the most part. And for this kind of show, it's not necessarily a bad thing, though don't expect anything massive on the plot department because you will be extremely disappointed. The show itself tries to make up for it through other means other than not having much of a plot in order to make it interesting. The biggest thing about this show that if you read the manga you're going to be very familiar with it is just how gritty it can be. Granted, the manga is a lot edgier, and it's a little bit toned down in the anime adaptation. It can still be pretty gruesome and violent at points when it so chooses to be, and the themes of violence it conveys can also be pretty messed up. Yes, the plot is simple, and it doesn't really go anywhere other than its one direction, but is that really a bad thing? For this kind of show, it's a pretty common practice, and on top of that, there are other shows that do fairly well with relatively linear or non-existent plots. The slice of life genre is a massive contender for this kind of thing. Another good way to make up for lack of plot is the characters of your show. Now, I'll be honest, original characters isn't exactly this show's strongest point. I mean, just looking at the main character himself, Tatsumi, he looks and acts like your typical generic shonen protagonist. And on top of that, the other characters themselves are often based on archetypes and character designs that you probably have seen in a number of other works previously existing. Does that mean they're all completely unlikable? No, there are some characters that are actually pretty interesting and you often feel for. But the major thing to keep in mind is that the show itself, when it comes to character design, is not exactly the forefront of creativity. Hey, speaking of characters, I think it's about time I mentioned something really important about this show that suffers from what I refer to as Gantz syndrome. This is a condition I prescribe to shows that have main characters that show up for very small amounts of time or are characters that you find very likable and mercilessly slaughters them without any care for what the viewers are feeling. Now, a number of series do this, not just Gantz itself and not just Akame ga Kill. I just find Gantz to be the easiest way to reference this. But yeah, I hope you don't like getting attached to characters because in Akame ga Kill, they die really frequently. And the interesting part about it is this: even when it's not necessarily a good guy, member of Night Raid, or main character who dies, sometimes you'll even feel bad when characters who are supposed to be villain characters end up biting the dust. At points, this show does this really well, and it does it with characters that oftentimes you really just want to feel for. Hence why every time you see a picture of Akame ga Kill on some social media network, you see people commenting things like, "Akame ga feels!" Of course, one needs to also keep in mind that when you're watching this show, this gimmick runs dry really fast at points, and oftentimes it feels like certain character deaths are just rushed for the sake of making them die. But when it does work, well, it it works, even with characters that are not fully fleshed out or developed, which is very common with the characters in this show. Other than being generic, they often don't have any form of character development that's present whatsoever. Needless to say, the generic designs and themes that are often way too overused, or moments in the series that just feel rushed, kind of make the series less enjoyable over time. At the start, I was pretty excited because I felt like it was pretty spot on with how the manga is. But of course, this kind of changes, as I said, mostly because of these problems. The show also doesn't necessarily have anything memorable going for it in terms of sound. There are some good tracks here and there for the OST, but most of it's just pretty much forgettable on top of the relatively uninteresting opening sequences the show has to offer. The animation itself can go from being fairly crisp and decent quality to just being above average. And it doesn't have any sort of style itself that makes it stand out from anything else. I will say one of the areas where the animation shines, however, is in some of the fight scenes early on in the series, because some of them are really nice looking. However, I feel as it progresses later on, some of them become a lot more forgettable and less enjoyable. One other thing that warrants mention about this series is the fact that it tends to throw in awkwardly placed humor at times, and sometimes this works considering that this is still at its core shonen and adds some lightheartedness to the relatively gritty nature it tries to create. Other times, however, it just kind of feels out of place. I was really excited when the anime was first announced, mainly because my favorite anime is made by Studio White Fox, who are the people behind this one. The big thing to keep in mind is that the show itself doesn't have anything massively original or unique about it that makes it stand out as its own thing. I feel like once the show is over, it's going to become one of those shows that people generally forget about. Now, I'm bashing a lot about this show, but I do want to mention, I did watch every single episode. I looked forward to every week's episode. It's just that it gets to certain points where it just felt like I was watching it more just to get it over with at points. There are some parts of the show that I found enjoyable, and I'm sure that a lot of other people found enjoyable as well. It's sad because if they had kept some of these themes and ideas they had with the show and made it consistent throughout, or added characters that were actually, original, and didn't give you them weapons that made it feel like it was just a device to throw in shonen-styled fight sequences, I would say that Akame ga Kill would be a really interesting anime for just about anyone who's a fan of the genre. But it falls victim to, like I said, a lot of gimmicks with being pretentious and just genuinely unoriginal. With that being said, after I make these points, I have to give the series a 6 out of 10. Like I said, I'm not going to completely bash it because there were parts of the show I genuinely enjoyed. And maybe it's just because I'm a fan of the manga and found the manga to be a lot better. But looking at it from this perspective, there are things that need to be noted about the series that drag it down a little bit.